When King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, was taken to Babylon, his sons were taken and killed that were the heirs to the throne. After his eyes were blinded, then his sons were killed just before, so that would be the last thing that he saw, so that there would be no heir to sit upon the throne of David. Jeremiah was not taken to Babylon. He was the prophet that was warning the people, and they would not do what the Lord was speaking through him for them to do. But Jeremiah was spared, but there was somebody else with him, and it was the daughters of the king of Judah that did escape, and they went to Mizpah. There is a rather astonishing history of King Zedekiah's daughters. They were the royal daughters of Judah. They escaped from Egypt. So let me get into this genealogical aspect of how they came to this conclusion that the British royal family was connected somehow to the princess of Judah that was known as Tamar Tephi. And they crossed the Mediterranean Sea, got blown off course, and supposedly landed on the coast of Ireland. So a lot of the kings and monarchs are claiming descent from Judah. But A.B. Grimaldi said the possible descent of Queen Victoria from King David was first entered upon in the present day by Reverend F.R.A. Glover, M.A., England, the Remnant of Judah, London, 1861. He did not, however, attempt to give the genealogy link by link, nor enter into the proofs in detail. Since then, the whole subject of Her Majesty's Jewish ancestry has been further examined by various students and writers on our Israelitish origin. Mr. J.C. Stevens has compiled a genealogical chart showing the connection between the House of David and the royal family of Britain, Liverpool, 1877. This gives the descent from Abraham to Zedekiah in full, as found in Matthew. It then gives 12 generations only between King Haraman of Ireland, 580 BC, and Victoria, AD 1819. Thus, of course, omitting a great number of links. The descent of our royal family from the royal line of Judah is, however, no new discovery. The Saxon kings traced themselves back to Odin, who was traced back to his descent from David, as may be seen in a very ancient MS, the Herald's College, London, and in Sharon Turner's History of the Anglo-Saxons, Volume 1. The full and complete genealogy of Victoria from David does not appear to have been ever printed, and it has therefore been thought that it would be useful as well as interesting to put it on record, both for reference and testimony. In its compilation, reliable works of reference have been used, such as Anderson's Royal Genealogies, London, 1732, Keating, History of Ireland, Dublin, 1723, and Lavoisnet, the Genealogical and Historical Atlas, London, 1814. Perfect accuracy is hardly to be expected in such an attempt, but it is believed that the genealogy is as correct as our present knowledge of this obscure and intricate subject will permit. In the following genealogy, those who reigned have K prefixed to their names. The dates after their private names refer to their birth and death, and those after sovereigns' names to their accession and death, so when they came upon the throne. Wherever known, the wives have been mentioned. Besides those mentioned in Genesis, some have been obtained from Polano, the Talmud, London, 1877. B and D stand for born and died. So they have a list here from Adam to Victoria and list all the generations. which is quite lengthy, so I'm not going to read off every name here. And it goes on, several pages here with the names of these people that reigned. We issue this leaflet to serve the grand and valuable object of supplying a necessary link in proving the identity of the British nation with the lost 10 tribes of Israel. This we have abundantly proved in the pamphlet entitled 47 Identifications of the British with Lost Israel. But we could not be identical with Israel unless Queen Victoria was in a line with David, it being written, "Ought ye not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingdom over Israel to David forever, to him and to his sons, by a covenant of salt," which is 2 Chronicles 13:5, 21:7, and have always been able to trace David's seed to Queen Tephi. Now that's Tamar Tephi, and she's the one who is said to have been one of Zedekiah's daughters that escaped when the sons were taken with the king, and the sons were slain before the king so that he would not have an heir on the throne, and his eyes were blinded. But the daughters escaped with the prophet Jeremiah, as it says in the Bible. So that is a fact according to the Bible. And they went to Mizpah first, and then Jeremiah could, they wanted to go to Egypt, but Jeremiah prayed and asked God what his wishes were, and he said, do not go to Egypt. Well, they convinced Jeremiah to go anyway. So this is where the story leaves off in the Bible, that it tells you that they did go to Egypt and that some people were slain, but others escaped. There is this legend about Tamar Tephi of Ireland, who was the daughter of Zedekiah the king, but the difficulty has been to supply a chart of the line from Queen Tephi to King Fergus of Scotland. And this we now supply through the valuable research of Reverend A.B. Grimaldi, M.A., and is in itself a matter vital to the very best interests of the British Empire. So it is this story and this lineage which they show. It goes to 160 people, so I can't read off the whole list. And there is also a woman named Scotta who was said to have been Pharaoh's daughter that came across. So whether they're one and the same or, they got mixed up, it's a question. But I'm going to read this history to you because originally I found this history when I was doing my own family genealogical chart. And my mom had read this. We read it on the computer and printed it out about this Tephi. It's T-E-A, Tephi, T-E-P-H-I, and she goes by Tamar Tephi, which is interesting because King David had the daughter Tamar. This is called Chapter 12, the Prophet Jeremiah's Mysterious Royal Commission. So we know in the Bible that Jeremiah and the daughter of Zedekiah, or daughters, went to Egypt, and that's where the story leaves off in the Bible. Who then is the tender one of Ezekiel's riddle? The answer in part lies with the mysterious commission given to the prophet Jeremiah. In the opening verses of the book that bears his name, we read that Jeremiah was to be used by God in a peculiar way. And it says, "See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down." And these are all negative terms, to be sure, but he was also to build and to plant. In Jeremiah 1:10, compare 18:9, 24:6, 31:28, and 32:4, and 42:10. Recall that God said he himself would plant a tender one. Would he use Jeremiah to accomplish this planting? Commentaries are at a loss to explain just how or when Jeremiah did this pulling down and building or planting. They simplistically link this aspect of his role to prophetic pronouncements concerning the rise or fall of nations. While this may be acceptable, certainly more is implied. As the passages listed above, God did indeed pluck up and plant nations or peoples. But what was Jeremiah's role in this regard? Shortly after the fall of Jerusalem and Zedekiah's death in Babylon, we find that Jeremiah was released from prison and dwelt among a small remnant still in the land of Judea. In Jeremiah 39:14 and 40, verse 6, the group was under the appointed governorship of Gedaliah, who was subsequently murdered by a fellow military leader named Ishmael. Surprise. Jeremiah 41:2, Ishmael apparently rejected the political arrangement. In verse 10, we read that Ishmael and his band took the entire remnant as prisoners. Notice who is particularly mentioned as being among this group. Then Ishmael took captive all the rest of the people, even the king's daughters, Zedekiah's daughters. So he was the king of Judah, the last ruling monarch, and his daughters were amongst this group that was taken and held captive. According to the account, a Jewish military captain named Yohanan rescued the captives. But fearing retaliation from the Babylonians for the murder of Gedaliah, Yohanan set out with the remnant for Egypt. In Jeremiah 41, verses 11 through 18. And this was in direct violation of God's instructions through Jeremiah to stay in the land and not fear the Babylonians in Jeremiah 42. Apparently, Yohanan took the group by force into Egypt, but Yohanan took all the remnant of Judah, men and women and children, and the king's daughters of Judah, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch his scribe. So they came into the land of Egypt, for they did not obey the voice of the Lord. So they came to Taphanes, it's also known as Taphnes. Jeremiah 43, 5 through 7. If you see pictures of it, it's got extraordinary artifacts just laying on the sand. It's just really amazing. And note that this was Yohanan's disobedience and not Jeremiah's. And also the fact that I think that somebody did come excavate it, now that I think back about it, in a certain point when they were excavating all the Egyptian things, but it's still largely unexcavated, so it would be astonishing to see what they found there. They did find a palace, I believe, and there was something that Jeremiah hid under a threshold, and they tried to locate that. Okay, thus Jeremiah, along with his faithful scribe Baruch, Jeremiah 36, etc., accompanied the king's daughters into Egypt. Zedekiah was only 32 when he was taken to Babylon in 2 Chronicles 36:11. So his daughters would have been relatively young, certainly in their early teens. History records their names, here we go, as Scotta and Tamar Tephi. So they were sisters, you guys. They weren't confused. Scotta and Tamar. Jeremiah was no doubt acting as a guardian for the young princesses. Remember, Jeconiah's line had been fully disqualified from ever inheriting the Davidic throne. And this is what some rabbis use to say that Jesus couldn't have reigned because he's a descendant of Jeconiah, his line that was cut off from the throne. However, the Messiah reversed the curse. Do you see that? So he can reign and reigns forever. And Zedekiah's sons had all been killed. So they were killed before his eyes were blinded, and Nebuchadnezzar told him, your sons being killed and slain as your heirs are the last thing you're ever going to see. The term tender one, as used in Ezekiel's riddle, certainly implies a young female. So you basically have to know all of this history to put all of this stuff together. And it says, could one of Zedekiah's daughters be used to perpetuate the throne? Would this be at all legal? Well, now here's the thing. Usually it was the son who took the throne and not the daughters. But if they went to another country to escape via the Mediterranean Sea, which everybody, including Solomon's navy with Hiram of Tyre, he went and got all of this merchandise from all these other nations. And we also know that the Apostle Paul traversed the Mediterranean Sea and, established all of these places, of worshiping the Lord. So this is interesting. According to Hebrew law, a man could pass the family inheritance on to a daughter if he had no son, in Numbers 27:8. Certainly this would apply even to the throne. Athaliah, wife of King Jehoram of Judah, took the throne by treachery. Nevertheless, her brief reign was not challenged because she was female in 2 Kings 11:1-3. The promise in Jeremiah 33:17 that David would never lack a man to sit on his throne must not be taken to exclude women. While the Hebrew word ish is used throughout the Old Testament to designate a male, the term is used frequently of humans in general. In Job 14:12 and 15:16, 34:21, Psalm 29:11, and 78:25. And there's more. But moreover, the legitimacy of the maternal line is clearly upheld in the fact that Jesus' only blood link back to David is through his mother Mary. And of course, the Jews today consider you a Jew through the maternal line, not the paternal line. So if you only have a Jewish father, you're not really considered Jewish, only if you go by your mother's lineage. It appears that Nebuchadnezzar's desire was to destroy the dynasty established under Solomon and permanently end the succession of Jewish kings. But the Babylonian king may have been completely unaware of Zedekiah's daughters. At the very least, he was apparently unfamiliar with Hebrew law, specifically that a princess could inherit the throne if there were no male heirs. There was, however, one stipulation. The heiress had to marry within the royal tribe, the tribe of Judah, if she was to retain the inheritance. See Numbers 36:6-7 for the precedent. Thus, Zedekiah's daughters had every right to the throne of their father as long as they married someone from the tribe of Judah. So now, could they have been removed from the land as a punishment, as the others were sent to Babylon? But this would set up for the end times king that the Sanhedrin would select, that would be the one that the Sanhedrin deems as their king Messiah. Well, that's interesting. Okay, the story of Jeremiah and Zedekiah's daughters ends with them still in Egypt, at least as far as the Bible goes. We are left to speculate based on historical accounts and prophecies of Ezekiel, the promises concerning David's throne, and the mysterious commission given to Jeremiah as to what happened next. Why does Scripture, in light of the demise of Jerusalem and the nation of Judah, the temple, and apparently the Davidic throne, mention twice that Zedekiah's daughters had survived? And why were they apparently under the guardianship of Jeremiah the prophet? What was Jeremiah to do with the king's daughters? Was one of Zedekiah's young daughters, the tender one of Ezekiel, taken from the tall cedar, the royal dynasty established under Solomon, and planted by Jeremiah in another land, which she ultimately married into a long-established Jewish ruling line, thus preserving the throne of David so that it could continue to rule over some part of the seed of Abraham? The overriding point to keep in mind is that God's promises never fail, and he has promised that David's throne would remain active throughout all generations. Thus, as that throne was ejected from the land of Judah, it must have been reestablished in a land where the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still settled. Okay, well, I have a point to this. It definitely could have been, at that point when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, that was carrying on the throne through him, but he's not here ruling. And he will come and take that throne from this king that the Sanhedrin picks out of Britain, I believe. Of course, I've talked all about it. Davidic throne planted in Ireland. From a biblical perspective, the story of Jeremiah, Baruch, and the king's daughters ends on a positive note. God had previously warned the Judaic remnant against going to Egypt. Later, he explicitly declared that the entire group would ultimately die in Egypt, except those who escape, which it says in Jeremiah 44:12 through 14. Obviously, Jeremiah and his party were not in rebellion against God. Thus, there is no doubt that they escaped God's final judgment on the Jewish remnant. Plus the fact that Jeremiah was set free, that he was not taken captive to Babylon with all the others and not taken with the king. Verse 28 indicates that a small number of them did, in fact, escape Egypt and return to Palestine. But as we will see, Jeremiah's mysterious commission was to take him and his royal party elsewhere, for he was to plant one of Zedekiah's daughters in a land already well populated by Israelites, the British Isles. Now, this is a claim. But as you will recall from chapter 9, Danite and Phoenician traders had explored and colonized the Isles back in the time of Solomon. In fact, it's probable that Danites had already settled the Isles back in the time of Israel's judges, as the tribe is criticized by Deborah, who governed Israel some 200 years before David for being away at sea. During a protracted local conflict in Judges 5:17, later, just prior to the fall of Samaria in about 722 BC, many more Danites and Israelites from other tribes set out by sea, that would be the Mediterranean, to avoid the Assyrian captivity. And naturally, they will have settled in areas already dominated by Israelites, the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles. Now, of course, I told you that Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots, and their king was deposed and taken off the throne, and they haven't had a king since. So when they put this British king on their throne through the Commonwealth, wouldn't that bring this whole thing full circle? And then Jesus is the one who comes down and takes the throne. And what I was going to say is that I said that Netanyahu was planning this India Middle East trade corridor where Jerusalem and Israel will gain their wealth in the last days as Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots. So it was the Mediterranean Sea where all of these things happened and where all the ships were that traversed, and the merchants and everything traded by the Mediterranean Sea, not the port of New York. All right, just want to throw that in there. Okay, there's a lot of information, so I'm really trying to read fast. But some of the earliest Danite settlements in the Isles were in Ireland. As these colonies became more developed, ruling clans of Danite kings arose. Eventually, however, these kings were superseded in Ireland by a Milesian line of kings made up of royalty from the Jewish line of Zerah, which is 1 Chronicles 2, 4, and 6. As will be brought out below, this royal line developed when Danite and Judah Zerite refugees settled parts of ancient Greece prior to Israel's enslavement while in Egypt. And this Milesian line eventually made its way to Ireland. Jeremiah's mission was to join the Davidic throne to the Irish throne through the marriage of Tamar Tephi, Zedekiah's daughter, to an heir of the Milesian line, a prince named Echad, which is very similar to, when they say the Aaronic blessing, and they say, I don't know, there's a word in there in Hebrew that sounds like Echad. And this is how Jeremiah was to plant a tender one in what would eventually become a high mountain, the Israelite birthright kingdom of Great Britain. You know, this just blows me away, because if this story is in fact truth and not just some legend, and the Sanhedrin picks King Charles III through becoming a member of the Commonwealth to be their king, since he was enthroned on the stone of destiny, which was considered to be Jacob's pillow stone, which Jacob had laid his head on, and it was taken from there, from Israel, supposedly by these daughters, and taken to Ireland. Okay, I know this sounds real far-fetched, but, you know, they did traverse the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, from this point we must look to the historical writings of ancient Ireland, which reveal that Jeremiah did indeed travel via Spain, Iberia, to the Isles with his scribe Baruch and a certain princess, Tamar Tephi. While the following account is summarized from authenticated histories rather than mere legends, it is important to realize that, as with any ancient narrative, a certain amount of contradiction is to be expected. The Irish were known for their dedication to recording their national history, which has been illustratively handed down in songs, poems, tales, and legends. As such, Irish historical figures have often been endowed with almost magical powers, and actual events have at times been obscured by embellishment as they were told and retold by Celtic bards. As the Isles entered the Christian era, Irish history was first written down by monks, who compiled the stories into rare manuscripts. But adding their own spin to the tales, these clerics often made the accounts more confusing. Still, experts in Irish history have been able to establish certain common storylines among the hundreds of ancient legends. As concerns Jeremiah and Princess Tamar Tephi, their arrival in the Isles is well documented in the annals of Irish history. However, the accounts differ, sometimes widely. Archaeologist E. Raymond Capt has concisely described Jeremiah's planting of the Davidic throne in Ireland. According to Capt, Irish records tell of a particular ship of the Iberian Danann coming to Ireland in about the year 583 BC, a mere 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, and this date varies somewhat in other accounts. Of course, the Babylonians came in 586, so that is a 3-year difference. The ship was of Danann origin, meaning it was linked to a particular group of Danites who had earlier settled in Greece. It came to Ireland by way of Iberia, which is Spain, and as the ship approached the northeast coast of Ireland, it ran aground near the area known today as Carrickfergus. Though the stories vary, it's clear as to the ship's passengers. An aged Hebrew patriarch called Olam Fadla and his attendant named Barak, as it is variously spelled in the legends, and an eastern king's daughter called Tephi. Irish tradition asserts that Olam Fadla was the prophet Jeremiah. Approximately, the name means honored prophet. Baruch, his scribe, can clearly be identified from the variations of his name listed above. The royal princess Tamar Tephi is identified in the archives as the daughter and heiress of King Zedekiah. Her sister Scotta is said to have remained behind in Spain. Jeremiah and his party apparently spent several months in Spain, Iberia. As John Fox writes in his classic book, The World's Greatest Throne, the various records include an account of the marriage between the royal princess and Echad, the Heremon, or king of Ireland, giving the princess's name as Tamar Tephi, which ironically was the daughter of King David. Her name was Tamar. Heremon means chief and was a title used of kings. Echad is traced in early Irish records as having descended from the patriarch Judah through the Zerah line. Echad is traced in early Irish records as having descended from the patriarch Judah through the Zerah line. In his Lost Tribes of Israel study maps, researcher Daniel Walsh relates information taken from the 1886 works The Book of Tephi. J.A. Goodchild wrote the book, which takes the form of a 3,000-line poem after spending years studying Irish legends. The poem records the journey of Tephi, or Tamar Tephi, Jeremiah, and Baruch from the house of Judah to the Isles of the West. The Isles are known as a home for the remnant of the tribe of Dan. The group left Tephanis, and that's Egypt, and the Nile Delta aboard a Hebrew ship from Tarshish, which is Iberia, Spain, and the ship's pilot was a Danite. Based on Goodchild's poem, Walsh goes on to outline the journey from Egypt. The Danite ship stopped at Carthage and then Rome, and the group then sailed to southern Spain, Iberia, Cartia, in the area of Gibraltar, where they stayed about 5 months. From there, they made a brief stop at Tarshish, or Tartessus, before going on to Cornwall in southern England. A few weeks later, the party made a short trip up the coast to eastern Ireland. Irish chieftains convened soon afterwards to confirm Echad as Ard Rai, High King of Ireland. Princess Tamar Tephi was also confirmed as queen, and a royal marriage was soon arranged. The poem who brings out that Echad's coronation was conducted over a unique stone brought to Ireland by Jeremiah called Leafale, or Wonderful Stone. That's the stone of destiny that King Charles III had under his chair at his coronation, because all the kings of Ireland and Scotland were coronated upon this stone. And this stone is apparently Jacob's pillar from Scripture and has been utilized in the coronation of all kings of Ireland, Scotland, and England who are traced back to Echad. Concerning Echad, Walsh writes, one of Ireland's rulers was a man named Echad Heremon. And Echad is Irish for the Greek name Achaeus, and the term Heremon is a title meaning chief of the landsmen, a king, and he was a Milesian living among the Tuatha De Danann. His genealogy traces back to Caucael in 1 Chronicles 2:6, 1 Kings 4:31, the Zerite founder of the Athens, who is said to have planted a royal dynasty in Ulster, Northern Ireland. Thus, Tamar Tephi, heiress to the Davidic throne, married into an existing Jewish royal line, which had been ruling for some time over Israelites settled in Ireland. As the new crowned queen of Ireland, Tephi brought the very authority of the throne of David to Echad's reign. According to tradition, Echad's coronation took place in about 580 BC, 6 years after the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon. And ultimately, through their offspring, the tender twig would become a majestic cedar in Ezekiel 17:22 through 23, a new royal dynasty in its own right, through which the Davidic throne would be perpetuated. Thus, in keeping with God's sure promises, David's throne has remained active, ruling over Israel in all generations. Well, personally, I believe that's the Messiah, but if this sets it up for the one who the Sanhedrin picks as their king in the end, isn't that stunning? Okay, this is really long, but I'm trying to read fast. The healing of an ancient family breach. The union of Tamar Tephi and Echad not only established a new dynasty over Israelites' Ireland, but it also resolved an ancient breach or division in the tribal family of Judah. And this breach, which took place shortly before Jacob relocated his family to Egypt, resulted from the unusual circumstances surrounding the birth of Judah's and Tamar's twins, Zerah and Pharez. And my mother's maiden name is very similar to Pharez. It's considered to be in that same family line of that spelling, which is not the same as how they spell it in the Bible, but that it developed. And so I've kind of researched that some. But as we see from the story in Genesis 38, Judah had arranged for his son Er to marry Tamar. But before they could have children, God killed Er for his wickedness. As was the custom, it fell to Er's brother Onan to raise up seed for his dead brother, but Onan refused and was also killed by God. The duty then fell to Judah's youngest son, Shelah, who was too young at the time, so Tamar lived as a widow at her father's house while waiting for Shelah to come of age. As time went by, Judah's wife died, and Shelah came of age, but for some reason Tamar was not given to Shelah. Becoming impatient, Tamar decided to take matters into her own hands. Determined to have a child, Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute in order to seduce Judah, her father-in-law. Tamar became pregnant and was subsequently sentenced by Judah to die for harlotry. Thus, Tamar was forced to reveal that Judah was in fact the father, a move that saved her life. When the time came for Tamar to give birth, her midwife discovered she was carrying twins, and surprisingly, one of the infants put forth its hand, to which the midwife promptly tied a red string, saying, "This one came out first." Assuming that it would be born first, the midwife was simply trying to keep track of which baby was first born. But the child withdrew its hand, and the other baby was born first. And to this unexpected turn of events, the midwife declared, "What a breach you have made for yourself," or "This breach be upon you," verse 29. And fittingly, this male child was named Pharez, meaning breach. His twin brother who had put forth his hand was named Zerah, meaning dawn, a name that suggests that he came first. And one must wonder why this story is included in Scripture, for this breach is never again mentioned. And what purpose could there be to these remarkable events? The unusual circumstances surrounding the twins' birth no doubt caused some controversy as to which child was truly the firstborn. At stake were the rights of the firstborn, a prominent aspect of Hebrew culture. The twins were born a short time prior to Jacob relocating his family to Egypt. And once in Egypt, it would be another 17 years or so before Jacob would give his prophecy of Genesis 49. And thus, when the boys were born, it was not yet known that Judah's offspring would inherit rights of royalty. Genesis 49:10. And because of this unique inheritance, the rights of royal lineage, the Pharez-Zerah controversy became paramount. Royal lineage was at stake, and while the biblical accounts of Judah's genealogy list Pharez first, the fact that Pharez was blamed for and even named for this breach implies the development of a significant brotherly rivalry. There is no doubt that Zerah and his subsequent Zerite line believed that they had been deprived of the firstborn position and the right to rule over Israel. And this family breach, however, would be resolved through the royal marriage of Echad and Tamar Tephi. Zerite migrations prior to the Exodus. By the time Pharez and Zerah were born, Joseph had already been in Egypt for some 20 years. Shortly after the 7-year famine began, Joseph relocated the father and all of his family to Egypt. Another 70 or so years would pass before Joseph died, and Scripture is silent concerning the transitional years following Joseph's death, except for this one note: "And there arose a new king, Pharaoh, over Egypt, who did not know Joseph," in Exodus 1:8. Much is implied in this ominous statement. Joseph and the Israelites were held in high regard. After all, they had been given Goshen, the most fertile region of the Nile Delta. Accordingly, we must not imagine that with Joseph's passing, there was a sudden end to the substantial Israelite influence in the land. who ruled as governor of Egypt after Joseph's death. And since all Israel understood that the scepter belonged to the tribe of Judah, we can make the assumption that Judah's descendants ruled not only over Israel while in Egypt, but also likely served as governors under Pharaoh. But who specifically ruled in Joseph's place, and how long did this unique political arrangement continue? We read in 1 Chronicles 2:5 that Pharez had two sons, Hezron and Hamul, and other than appearing in genealogical listings, nothing noteworthy is ever said about either son. Since Pharez was the accepted firstborn of Judah, we might assume that his sons ruled in Joseph's place. But perhaps not, and we also read that Zerah had 5 sons. Verse 6, and 3 of them were noteworthy, Heman, Calcol, and Dara. In 1 Kings 4:31, Solomon's extraordinary wisdom is compared to the wisdom demonstrated by other celebrated leaders, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. And it is generally accepted that Calcol is the later variation of Kolkol, that Darda is the later variant of Dara. But how are these 3 brothers, the son of Mahal, were they not sons of Zerah? Several commentaries note that Mahal is not a proper name as such, but an appellation describing particular characteristics or skills common to these men. Adam Clarke, for example, writes that the term signifies dance or music, that a son of Mahal was a person particularly skilled in music. Well, isn't that interesting? My mother's name, which is a variant of Pharez, and music was always my life's work. But why would Solomon be compared to these 3 Zerites who predated him by centuries? Why would they be noted for great wisdom unless they, like Solomon, were great leaders, perhaps governors in their own day? If so, when did these sons of Zerah rule? Could it be that they ruled as governors in place of Joseph over Israel and perhaps Egypt, well prior to the children of Israel becoming enslaved to the Egyptians? At any rate, this Zerite dynasty was apparently well respected by both Israelite and Egyptians. For a time, perhaps as long as 100 years, at least 2 generations would need to pass in order for a Pharaoh to arise who had no knowledge of Joseph. But the Israelites eventually fell out of favor with the Egyptians, who saw them more and more as foreign usurpers of power. It was only natural that there would be a gradual loss of the loyalty that was originally tied to Joseph. In time, the Egyptians would indeed ask, who was this Joseph? And thus the untimely collapse of Zerite rule in Egypt is suggested in the simple statement found in Exodus 1:8. Soon the Israelites were no longer welcome in Egypt and were no doubt greatly persecuted. And as we know from Scripture, this eventually led to slavery. As circumstances went from bad to worse, it appears that the wealthy and powerful Israelites fled Egypt by ship. Given the fact that the Danites later proclivity for seamanship, it is likely that they were already exploring the Mediterranean. The ruling aristocratic Zerites would have also left Egypt before the situation reached a crisis point. The unprivileged masses were left behind to go into slavery and ultimately be delivered under Moses. Later, in the Promised Land, the Pharez line would inherit the throne over the kingdom of Israel, starting with King David. Of course, another possibility is that the Pharez line actually ruled in Egypt, which prompted the disfranchised Zerites to abandon Egypt by sea. While all of this may sound a bit too speculative, history does support this scenario. For example, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, circa 80 to 20 BC, tells of several Israelite flights from Egypt at this very time, most notably into Greece under 2 key Israelite leaders, Danaus and Cadmus. Quoting Diodorus, Walsh writes that the Egyptians claimed that a large number of colonies were spread from Egypt over all the inhabited world, and that exiles led by Danaus settled what is practically the oldest city of Greece, Argos. According to Walsh, other ancient sources verify that Danos captured and developed Argos, known originally as Danae. Ancient Greek literature refers to these Egyptian pioneers as Danans, Danadai, or Danai, noting that they spread throughout much of what today is known as Greece, reaching as far as Macedonia, which retains Dan's name. Danos was obviously of the tribe of Dan. Other Danites, of course, went into slavery in Egypt. Later, under Moses and Joshua, these Danites were not surprisingly given a coastal territory in Palestine, favoring their love of the sea travel. And at some point, perhaps before Solomon's time, Ireland was settled by some of these same Greek Israelites known as the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan, whose ancestors had fled Egypt. And doesn't it say in the Bible that this Antichrist person will be, it insinuates that only Dan isn't mentioned in Revelation because he's connected to the Antichrist? But what became of the royal Zerites who abandoned Egypt? History shows that the Greek city of Athens was founded by the legendary Cecrops. Diodorus wrote that Athens was settled by colonists from Sais, Egypt, located along the Nile Delta, branch of Judah. Was Cecrops an Israelite? Walsh notes that some scholars maintain that Cecrops is none other than Calcol of the Zerah branch of Judah, and he adds, like their Phoenician counterparts, the seafaring Danites and Zerites spread Israelite colonies throughout the Mediterranean. It is even said that Calcol planted a royal dynasty of Irish kings in Ulster. Indeed, the ancient Greeks spoke highly of the Irish. Diodorus said that the Irish were most friendly disposed towards the Greeks, especially towards the Athenians. Calcol's brother, Darda, is said to have founded the city of Troy. The first Trojan king was Dardanus, undoubtedly a variation of Darda, from whom the Dardanelle Strait obviously derives its name, and Capt writes that the descendants of Darda ruled ancient Troy for some 100 years, and he adds that Zerite descendant Brutus migrated to Britain, to what they called the Great White Island, due to its massive chalk cliffs, and established New Troy, later called London, as a variation of the Roman Londinium. That's very interesting. Concerning Zerite expansion to the west, Capt writes, historical records tell of the westward migration of the descendants of Calcol along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, establishing Iberian, which is Hebrew, which is Spain, trading settlements. One settlement now called Saragossa in the Ebro, like Ebro is short for Hebrew. Valley in Spain was originally known as Zaragoza, meaning the stronghold of Zara. Back to the east is Italian island known Sardinia, which retains elements of both Zara and Dan in its name. Sardinia. Capt continues, from Spain they continued westward as far as Ireland. The Iberians gave their name to Ireland, calling the island Iberne, which was subsequently Latinized to Hibernia, a name that still adheres to Ireland. Many historical records point to Israel's presence, particularly Dan and Judah, in Ireland at a very early date. Writers such as Patanus and Hecatochus speak of the Dani as being Hebrew people originally from Egypt who colonized Ireland. He adds that in Moore's History of Ireland, it states that the ancient Irish called the Dani, or Danes, separated from Israel around the time of, actually well prior to, the Exodus from Egypt, crossed to Greece, and then later invaded Ireland. A Zerite Milesian royal line. History indicates that the Athenians, whose Jewish families were Zerites via Calcol, took the Greek city of Miletus around 1000 BC, and thus those known in history as Milesians are actually Judah-Zerites. As noted earlier, Calcol is credited with planting a Zerite dynasty in Ireland. Precisely when this took place is not clear, and most likely scenario is that one of Calcol's descendants, a Milesian bearing the Calcol family name, established a royal dynasty in Ulster some years after the Zerites settled Miletus, and their Danite brothers had already begun to settle Ireland, going back to the time of the judges or earlier. The so-called Milesian invasion of Ireland was in reality an effort by Zerites from Miletus to exert rulership over their Israelite kinsmen. According to Capt, one of the earliest and best preserved chronicles of Ireland, known as the Plantation of Ulster, includes the Milesian records. These archives give an account of Milesian conquerors of Ireland belonging to the Scarlet branch of Judah, the Zerites. And he writes, the Milesians invaded Ireland in about 1000 BC, subjugating the Dedanin. Both the Dedanin and the Milesians were kinsmen, who long ages before had separated from the main Hebrew stem, possibly while in Egypt. Many historians today erroneously refer to these people as Celts and Gaels, whereas, in fact, they are only forerunners of the Celtic tribes that later wound their several ways across Europe from the east, finally blending in one great Gaelic stream into the islands of Britain. The Celts were also kinsmen, but mainly of the latter westward overland migrations of the Israelite tribes following their captivity in Assyria. Concerning the historical scarlet branch of Judah, he adds, it was Zerah's hand bound with a scarlet thread that probably accounts for the origin of the heraldic sign employed even today in Ulster, Northern Ireland, consisting of a red hand coupled at the wrist with a scarlet thread. And you'll see that on some of the flags, banners, and things. While the Irish today are largely unaware of the true origin and meaning of this symbol, it is nevertheless strong proof that the ancient Zerites who left their indelible imprint on the British Isles had long remembered the unique and unfavorable circumstances of Zerah's birth and sought a way to reconcile their apparent loss of royal rights. The marriage of Echad, a Milesian of Zerite descent, to Tamar Tephi, who through David was of Pharez's descent, healed this ancient branch by uniting both lines in the establishment of a new royal dynasty. To revisit the prophecy of Ezekiel 21, we can see that God had abased the one who had been high King Zedekiah and the entire nation of Judah, for they lost the throne. And they said, Jeremiah wrote in Lamentations, woe is us, the crown has fallen from our head. And remember, I told you that the Lord, the Holy Spirit, told me, look at the crown given to the white horse rider. Well, it clicked. The Sanhedrin, that's of the Antichrist, the anti-Jesus spirit, they made a gold crown to give to this king when he comes to Israel. He's got the white horse that has a trumpeter that rides out to announce his arrival. So that's when the true heir pops the first seal of the judgments, because they're rejecting the true heir to the throne of the Davidic dynasty, which is King Jesus. Okay, and if he's descended from this group, then God's bringing it all back together, and he's going to take the throne from this group. In the riddle of Ezekiel 17, the trees of the field are likened to the other nations of the world, which would in time come to realize that God had brought down the high tree, Judah, casting her into slavery while exalting the low tree, Israel. Indeed, God had dried up the green tree, removing its prized Davidic throne, and established it in Irish Israel so that the formerly dry tree might flourish. I'm about to read to you the most astonishing statement. From this new Zerite Pharez dynasty would spring many Israelite monarchs, all ruling in the British Isles. In fact, all of the royal lines of Ireland, Scotland, and England trace back to this fateful union, including Queen Elizabeth II, who was at that time said to occupy the Davidic throne, held in reserve for its rightful heir, the Messiah. Importantly, Genesis 49:10 indicates that there will be a monarch of Jewish descent ruling from David's throne in the last days. You guys, that would be King Charles III, who the Antichrist Sanhedrin will make their king. And that, it says, there will be a monarch of Jewish descent ruling from David's throne in the last days, just prior to Jesus' return to claim the throne as the rightful heir. Thus, through the prophet Jeremiah's mysterious royal commission, the scepter remained fully in the possession of the tribe of Judah. The Davidic throne was preserved for safekeeping in the British Isles, and a land was prepared to accept Celtic and Anglo-Saxon Israelites who would over several centuries migrate to their new home. It says the entire royal line can be traced from David to Queen Elizabeth II in the book The Royal House of Britain, An Enduring Dynasty by W.M.H. Milner, Covenant Publishing, London, 1991. No honest researcher denies the myriad of contradictions in Irish history. What is important, however, is that the identity of modern Israel does not hinge on a perfect understanding of Irish history or the transfer of David's throne to Ireland. The massive amount of evidence available today clearly demonstrates lost Israel's migration from the Middle East to the British Isles. As such, it far surpasses any unanswered questions regarding David's throne being established in the Isles. And also they said, that they have the harp on the flag. And isn't it interesting that the rabbis, Rabbi Berger, when he made a Torah scroll to give to this King Messiah, when he comes there with the gold crown, not the silver Torah scroll crown given to Trump. This is a gold crown to give to a king, someone they'll call their Messiah. And this Torah scroll that they created has David's harp on the cover, along with the Star of David. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and support this channel.